Hello, everyone. I think it's 9 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. So thank you very much for joining this morning. My name's Marta Isabel Garcia, the head of Stevenson Harwood's competition and foreign direct investment team here in London. Before we get started, just two practical matters. The webinar will be recorded and available in due course, and you will see that we have a Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. So please do feel free to ask any questions and we will look to answer them at the end in our Q&A session. Now, as many of you may know who dialed in last week, in part one of our FDI in Focus webinar series, we considered the EU's FDI framework regulation and other tools available to the Commission to protect EU and national strategic assets. Today, in part two, we're going to take a closer look at some more important FDI themes and trends that we're finding are arising across a number of jurisdictions in Europe, including in France, Germany, Spain, and the UK. In particular, the broad jurisdictional reach of FDI screening regimes, the different review timetables, and increasingly tougher enforcement of FDI rules across the EU, before we provide some more practical advice on the impact of these rules on M&A transactions and recommendations on how best really to successfully navigate these FDI regimes. Now, today we're joined by our excellent expert panel from each of Germany, Spain, France, and the UK. We have Dr. Frederic Weimer from Heuking in Germany, Ana Cremades from Pérez Llorca in Spain, Guillaume Briand from our Paris office in Stevenson Harwood, and Will Spence from London in Stevenson Harwood. So if we kick off with the broad jurisdictional reach of the FDI regimes and why that may be the case, one aspect that we're increasingly finding is that previously a number of member states would have made a distinction between an EU and a non-EU investor to try and capture only those investments made by those outside of the EU. But we're finding that has changed. So I wanted to ask the panelists in the first instance whether the origin of the buyer is a key factor in their FDI screening regimes and whether they're finding that is generally the case across Europe. Will, I wondered whether you might want to start with the UK's position, given they're just about to introduce the National Security and Investment Act here in the UK.
Yeah, of course, Marlon. Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a very interesting feature of the investment screening process that takes place here in the UK, or that will under the National Security and Investment Act, or NSIA, as I will hereafter refer to it, that there is no concept of, say, a foreign buyer or a foreign entity. Technically speaking, the applicable screening legislation is agnostic towards the nationality of the incoming investor. And indeed, our laws are perfectly capable of capturing strictly domestic transactions and parties whose only place of incorporation is here in the UK. And this position is true under the current regime that we have under the Enterprise Act that will shortly be replaced by the NSIA. And I think it's very telling that the UK government has very deliberately steered away from labeling the NSIA as a foreign direct investment regime. The focus of the Act is not on foreign direct investment per se, but on national security. And I think it's an important distinction because the two are not mutually exclusive. UK government sees the potential for risks arising from purely domestic transactions in, say, sensitive sectors where, in the wrong hands, they could foresee a potential for a national security threat. And that is true, for instance, because a domestic transaction might involve target and an acquirer who have foreign parent companies, and the UK government recognizes that national security risks do not strictly arise from foreign direct investment, notwithstanding the fact that that is where we would typically see national security threats. So I think that lack of specifications is indeed a very interesting feature here in the UK.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you. Good morning from Germany. If I may add, indeed the approach to FDI control has been rather liberal in Germany in the past. However, in the wake of critical investments by non-EU states, especially from China, in acquisitions in sensitive and high technology industries, there have been political concerns that have led to a tightening grip on FDI. Now the scope of ex-ante FDI approval is much larger. The notification requirements are threefold under Germany's laws. First, there is a so-called sector-specific review which deals with investment projects that are particularly relevant to Germany's national security. This applies to any investor who is not a German national. For instance, also European nationals. It applies to companies that are active in very sensitive sectors, such as war weapons or other military technology and security products in the IT industry. And then second, there is the so-called general or cross-sector examination. This limits acquisitions by non-European investors across a catalog of sectors, including emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, semiconductors, and quantum nuclear technologies. And then thirdly, there is a catch-all provision where the regulator has the power to take up and screen each and every transaction by any investor that it founds to be likely to affect the security or public order in Germany. And this general catch-all provision, however, in this area, it is not needed to have an upfront notification, but it's more a ex-post control after closing.
Thank you, Frederick. And Anna, what's happening in Spain?
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, from the Spanish FDI, from the Spanish perspective, the FDI regime considers as foreign investor all non-EU EFTA resident, and that means first residents in any country other than the EU EFTA member states, or residents in the EU EFTA member state whose beneficial ownership corresponds to resident outside the EU or EFTA. This category includes any EU EFTA companies in which residents of countries outside the EU EFTA directly or indirectly possess or control 25% of more of the shares or the voting rights of the company, or otherwise exercise direct or indirect control. Also, we have a transitory regime that would be in place until December 2022, and this affects to EU EFTA residents where the investments refers to a Spanish listed company or exceeds more than 500 million euros in a Spanish non-listed company. In any case, not all FDI investments are subject to prior authorization, only those that fall under the restricted sectors, that is the objective perspective, or despite the sectors, when the foreign investor meets certain requirements, and that's what we call the subjective perspective. And that means that the non-EU or EFTA resident fall in any of the following categories. First, in case the investors directly or indirectly are directly or indirectly controlled by the government of a third country, including the governmental bodies or armed force. Second, in case the investor have made investment or participate in business related to security, public order, or public health in another EU member state. Or third, in case the investor present a serious risk of carrying out illegal activities affecting public security, order, or health in Spain. As you see, the aim of the Spanish regulation is to capture as many types of deals of review as possible that could potentially raise a national security concern.
In France, hi everyone, in France, the former distinction between EU and non-EU foreign investors has been abolished. Now, FDI rules apply to any restricted investment by any foreign investor, which is defined as a foreign citizen or a French citizen not having its tax residence in France, as well as entities of foreign law or governed by French law, but which are controlled, that's the ultimate criteria, which are controlled by one or more of the persons which are foreigners that we previously identified. It should be noted that any entity that is part of a chain of control may also qualify as a foreign investor. So we agree that the rules on who can be investor for FDI purposes has increasingly been broadened across the FDI regimes in the different countries.
Thank you, Guillaume. That's very clear and very interesting. And I guess another aspect that we're finding, other than the broadening, obviously, of the origin of the investor, is the fact that most FDI regimes are really only triggered once there is some form of acquisition of control or some acquisition of shareholding. And that what we are seeing, that increasingly those thresholds seem to be getting lower and lower. And obviously, we're assuming that is to capture as many types of deals as possible in the event that they could raise some form of national security concern or risk. I think it would be interesting to hear, though, what we're finding in terms of the level of those thresholds more generally across Europe and in your specific jurisdictions. I wonder whether Anna could kick off that discussion.
Yes, thank you, Marta. Yes, as you were saying, there are different investment thresholds across the EU member states and worldwide. In Spain, the concept of FDI involves the acquisition of 10% or more of share capital of a Spanish entity by a foreign investor or a foreign investor obtaining the control of the Spanish entity despite of the percentage of the share capital they are acquiring. Also in Spain, we have a monetary threshold of 1 million euro or more, and also a transitory threshold, as I have mentioned before, of 500 million in case of acquisition made by EU or EFTA investor in non-listed company. But as I have said, this will only be in place until 13 December of 2022. In other jurisdictions, low thresholds are established, and this includes, for example, Latvia, Czech Republic, Finland, as well as France and Germany. Indeed, Italy has one of the lowest thresholds, whereby if the deal is in the defense or national security sector, an acquisition of more than 10% of equity share capital may trigger the regime. So it is clear that certain countries have set the FDI control trigger threshold very low to capture as many potentially problematic deals as possible, but others tend to have a different and higher threshold set at, for example, 25%, 50%, or 75%.
That's right, Anna. For example, France is one of those jurisdictions where we have different control thresholds. In fact, in France, the notion of foreign investment covers, first, the acquisition by foreign investors of a direct or indirect controlling interest in a French entity, including in the case of acquisitions of joint control. Second, the acquisition by foreign investors of all or part of a branch of activity of a French entity, and that would cover asset deals. And third, for non-EU or members of the European Economic Area investors only, the acquisition of more than 25% of the voting rights of a French entity. But be careful on this one, because France reduced this 25% mandatory trigger threshold to 10% specifically for investors for investments in listed companies by non-EU or non-EEA investors. However, this amendment is only temporary, but it should be noted that yesterday, the French Ministry of Economy announced that this threshold will be extended for another year until 31st December 2022.
Guillaume and Frederick.
Yes, thank you, Marta. This is also the case in Germany, which has different triggering thresholds depending on which sector is involved. For deals, for instance, in the military area or critical infrastructure, such as energy, an acquisition of only 10% or more of the voting rights will trigger a mandatory ex-ante filing requirement. For other cross-sectoral industries, higher thresholds of 20% exists. And then a renewed notification is required where shareholdings are increased, meeting 20%, 25%, 40%, 50%, or 75% thresholds, depending on which sector is concerned. As regards the catch-all provision, there is a general 25% threshold that exists. However, here, as I mentioned before, there is no pre-closing approval legally required for this category. But given that the authorities may take up any transaction under this catch-all provision that may imply national security risks, the parties may voluntarily apply for a so-called certificate of non-objection to get deal security before the closing. Thank you.
Thanks. And Will, what's happening in the UK? Because obviously we have this material influence concept, which also generally tends to trigger at a low level.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the UK has taken its lead from other FDI jurisdictions across Europe when constructing the NSIA. If I come back to the material influence threshold in a moment, Marta, it's worth noting that the mandatory regime that will be introduced in the UK, which will apply to acquisitions of shares or voting rights in UK target companies which are active in one or more of 17 key sectors, there will be a low threshold of 25% that will apply to these acquisitions, in addition to increasing existing shareholdings above 50 and 75%, which again are very low thresholds. Even though an initial low of 15% was increased to 25%, UK government is clearly giving itself maximum flexibility to review transactions in this sector. And underpinning the mandatory regime is the NSI's voluntary regime, which will have the same applicable thresholds as under the mandatory one, but with this additional level of material influence, Marta, that you mentioned, which for those familiar with the UK merger control rules will know can apply to acquisitions of shares or voting rights as low as 10% or 15%. So the UK government clearly is following its lead from other countries here and trying to give itself maximum flexibility to review deals where there might be any national security concern.
Thanks, Will. So, I mean, it's pretty clear there are varying thresholds across the different EU FDI regimes that investors and clients need to be aware of, and that they are increasingly getting lower, which obviously broadens the scope of the types of deals can get caught. What we're also recently seeing increasingly is also that the target that is the subject of the investment is needing to be in a particular sector. And whereas previously you would have found, say, defense or critical infrastructure would have been those types of sectors of national strategic importance, we're now finding that a number of different, you might even consider innocuous sectors, are now being caught. And I think especially since COVID, we are seeing that expansion into other sectors, including in healthcare, obviously, as a result of COVID, and technology. But I wondered, I guess, here whether each of you could comment on this expansion of sectors, because I think it is quite interesting for clients to understand that it is getting to that point almost that no matter what sector you're in, you will need to start to think about these FDI rules. Frederick, should we start with you? Because obviously Germany has been very active there.
Yes, thank you, Marta. Indeed, it is, I can confirm this for Germany. Indeed, the so-called sensitive sectors are no longer limited to areas like military defense or energy grids. In Germany, the government introduced stricter rules and a long list of products and areas also in response to the pandemic. For instance, for companies that develop or produce goods that are essential for the healthcare system. For this purpose, manufacturers of vaccines, antibiotics, medical protective equipment, and medical products for the treatment of infectious diseases have been added to this rather long list that we have now. In addition, the government is also looking to further restrict investments in areas of IT, artificial intelligence, robotics, biotechnology, and quantum technology. So indeed, we have seen an increase in Germany in the sectors that may be subject to FDI rules. Thank you.
Frederick.
If I might comment for the UK, as I mentioned, the mandatory regime that will come into play under the NSIA will apply to target companies in the UK active in one or more of 17 so-called sensitive sectors. 17 is obviously a large number. This has been expanded significantly from the list of sectors which, albeit were not subject to mandatory notification under the public interest regime, but were noted as those areas of particular concern. This reflects the UK government's increasing desire to monitor what they believe are evolving and changing national security threats, noting the fact that typically these days national security concerns arise from places where they would not previously have expected it to. So whilst we still have the traditional sectors such as defense and energy, for example, we now have new ones that might be considered to have had a previously tangential nexus to national security, but which are now prominent in an increasingly digitalized society and economy in which we live, such as advanced materials, artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology, to name a few. And it's really important to note that these sector definitions are now finalized. The UK government published its statutory instrument last week on the 15th of November. And these definitions have now been fully clarified and crystallized. But I would mention also that, as you said, Marta, the UK government realizes and is keen to give itself the flexibility to review deals which may be in areas which seem innocuous or benign. And that's predominantly the reason why the voluntary regime exists, is to give the UK government the ability to call in deals which are not notified to it using its discretionary call-in power, noting the fact that national security threats, as I say, arise from many and varied industries these days.
Thank you.
In France, we have had a similar experience. The list of sensitive sectors subject to foreign investment control has been substantially expanded in recent years, notably to activities essential to press, to food security, or in the context of the health crisis, to biotechnologies, as well as research on renewable energies.
Well, in Spain, as we have mentioned, the government intervenes on grounds of the characteristic of the investor, but also regarding the strategic nature of the sector invested. There are numerous of sectors deemed strategic, affecting public safety, public order, and public health, and these sectors have been listed in the recent FDI regulation and can be classified as the sectors dealing with critical infrastructure, sectors dealing with critical and dual-use technologies, also the sectors regarding supply of essential inputs such as energy, raw material, strategic connectivity, also the sector related to access to sensitive information, and sectors related with media. The problem we are fighting now in Spain is that the definition of the sector that is included in the regulation is so broad that allows the FDI authority to have different interpretations. So it is difficult to anticipate whether a particular transaction will be or not under the scope of the law. So what the government has done is that, well, the Spanish FDI authority has done is that they have implemented a consultation system. So prior to submitting a formal filing for this FDI authorization, you can submit a consultation to the authority, and you can get the confirmation on whether a particular transaction is considered or not under the scope of the law because of the interpretation of the activity and the interpretation of the sectors that I have mentioned.
Anna, thank you. And I think that's a very important point, I think, for investors and clients, targets to bear in mind that a number of the regimes across Europe, because they have such expanded lists now of sectors that could apply, they are quite technical and quite complex, and sometimes very, very difficult to apply, regardless of the fact that obviously the regulators also take quite a subjective view to that. And you are finding increasingly that you do need to approach a regulator in advance to understand whether or not you fall within that scope. And I know that's something we're experiencing here in the UK in particular, given the breadth of sectors that again can be covered under the NSIA. And I think another important point as well for investors and targets to also understand when it comes to FDI regimes is the actual nexus that needs to apply. So in effect, the extraterritorial scope of the FDI rules. I think something that obviously is very important in the UK, because we're finding it does have such a broad extraterritorial application, is the fact that at least in the UK, the NSIA can potentially apply not just to investments made by UK and non-UK investors, but in UK and non-UK targets where there is some nexus, so where they supply goods or services into the UK or carry on some form of activities in the UK. So the UK in particular has taken the approach that it will capture pure foreign to foreign type transactions. So again, it would be interesting to understand if in your regimes as well, you are finding that they're taking that broad interpretation when it comes to extraterritorial application. And Frederick, maybe you can start off this time.
Yes, thank you, Marta. Indeed, the notion of direct investment suggests that FDI screening may only impact investments where a foreign investor directly invests in a European target. The reality, however, also covers indirect investments. So in most European FDI regimes, indirect acquisitions are covered expressly by the law, with the consequence that even where a foreign investor uses its European majority-owned subsidiary to indirectly conduct the investment, FDI screening applies. Thus, even indirect acquisitions by the foreign parent may trigger a filing requirement. And on top of that, in some member states, the intermediary acquirer does not even need to be majority owned. For instance, if the foreign investor holds only 10% or more of the voting rights in the directly acquiring European-based company, even then the acquisition, for instance, of a German target active in a critical sector must be subject to foreign direct investment screening by the authority. Thank you.
I mean, it's quite clear that there is such a broad application of these FDI rules. Will and Guillaume, maybe I can ask, is it right also that most FDI regimes just don't have a safe harbor? So it is getting more and more difficult to give clients any real comfort that their deals may not be caught by the FDI rules?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Marta. It's certainly the case that in the majority of jurisdictions in the EU, at any rate, there are very few applicable safe harbors or exemptions when it comes to matters of FDI and national security reviews. There are exceptions. We might note, for example, Austria, which introduced a de minimis threshold, which is applicable to acquisitions of Austrian target entities with fewer than 10 employees and with annual revenues or assets or which do not exceed 2 million euros. But these situations are rare. And I think it's fair to say that on the whole, EU governments are keen not to provide any free passes to investors when it comes to these matters. And certainly that is the case here in the UK. The UK government has very deliberately not introduced any applicable exemptions or safe harbors for parties to maximize its flexibility, which I keep coming back to. Thus, in the UK, it does not matter what the value of the transaction is, what the respective market shares of the parties are, or how much turnover they generated in the previous year. These factors, frankly, are immaterial to the UK government from a FDI perspective. And all of this complements the fact here in the UK that the new regime will apply to a very broad array of transactions. So it's not just shares or voting rights, but it's also asset deals, property deals, IP licensing, IPOs, and even lending arrangements. So between one thing and the other, there really is very little maneuverability for parties to structure their deals so as to avoid the NSIA regime biting here in the UK or any FDI regime across Europe being applicable to transactions in certain circumstances.
Thanks, Will. Guillaume.
Yes, well, in France, it's also our understanding. Under French law, there is no specific threshold in terms of turnover, asset size, purchase price, or enterprise value. Therefore, even minor transactions may be subject to screening. The investor is exempted, however, from filing an application for prior approval in the following situations. First, in case of intragroup investments. So it's actually curious that the UK has taken a different approach. Or second, in situations where the foreign investor already obtained approval for investing in the target if certain conditions are fulfilled. So, Marta, as you indicated, the breadth of the FDI rules, especially in Europe, is broad and increasingly so.
Thank you. And I guess obviously an important question that clients will ask, obviously, once they appreciate and understand that their deals or arrangements could be caught by the FDI rules is, well, really, is the regulator going to be interested? Does my deal actually raise a national security concern? So what does this concept actually mean? And does it just take into account purely national security considerations or anything else, be it of a political or economic nature? So I know we get asked that very often under the NSIA. Frederick, would you care to comment as to what this national security concern means, or what it is the regulators are really focusing on here?
Yes, thank you. In different European member states, the basis for government intervention varies. Indeed, some regimes have a narrow focus on national security or public order issues, such as Germany, for instance, whereas other member states have a broader scope, considering national interest. For instance, as I understand, the UK has powers under the Enterprise Act to intervene on public interest grounds in certain media and financial sector mergers. However, what is clear is that there is no uniform approach to be identified between different European countries. In other words, no one member state has shown itself to have the same exact national security concerns as the other. So each deal needs to be assessed, as a matter of fact, on a case-by-case basis, depending on the member states that are relevant.
So it's super clear then, I guess, for clients when they're trying to interpret and understand what a national security concern is. Anna, could you comment maybe on what sorts of deals the FDI regulators tend to intervene in or look at more closely?
Yes, Marta. Well, these can vary, but overall, the cases that appear to have been investigated by regulators around the world, including in the EU, could be split into three broad categories where national security concerns have tended to arise, where there is first an acquisition of control over key strategic asset business, for example, in the energy, in the high-tech sector, critical infrastructure or supply chains. Second, if the deal grants the acquirer access to material, confidential commercial information that could harm national interest. For example, we are talking about personal information, proximity of security installations. Or third, when there is a necessity to preserve capacity, for example, national champion, critical technology, retention of R&D capabilities. In particular, we are seeing also an increased review of, for example, Chinese investment business, based in this case on political concern, which will be touched upon later when we discuss current and former trends.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I think that's really useful for parties to understand in terms of where the focus seems to be. I mean, another important aspect that obviously we get asked by clients frequently once they are caught by the rules is just how long does this review process take? Is it a swift one or not? Now, many FDI regimes we'll have a phase 1 and then a phase 2, which involves a far more in-depth review. So almost similar to what we find under the merger control rules. Anna, can you comment on this as well? Are you finding that reviews tend to be swift, or are they lengthy typically? What should clients and parties by these rules expect?
Yes, well, what we see is that these review timetables differ across the member states. And having said that, it is true that certain jurisdictions are known for having swifter review processes, as for example France, in which a decision can be expected within 30 business days from the request for clearance. And this can be extended by a further 45 business days in complex matters. Regarding Spain, on the other hand, what the regulation says is that the regulator has up to 6 months from the date of the application by the foreign investor to approve the FDI. In case you do not get a decision in this period of 6 months, your FDI application shall be deemed to be rejected. But as I was commented before, we also have the possibility to submit a consultation prior to the FDI filing in order to get confirmation on whether a filing it is needed or not. And the time that is taking this consultation is about 4 or 6 weeks in order to get an informal confirmation from the FDI authority. And also it has to be taken into account that although I have said that the regulation establishes a 6-month period in order as the maximum time in order to get the authorization, what we are normally seeing is that the Spanish Council of Ministers is taking about 3 or 4 months in order to issue the authorization. Also, for example, if we talk about the UK's new NSIA regime, this will allow phase 2 reviews to extend to 105 working days, but this may be increased by mutual agreement between the parties and the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Anna. I think we're waiting eagerly to see actually whether the UK regime will be one of the swiftest or not, as they have recently said they hope to be. Frederick, what's the position in Germany?
Yes, thanks, Marta. In Germany, also the mandatory review process can take some time, similar as to merger control cases. As I mentioned earlier, there is a mandatory notification obligation for cross-sectoral and sector-specific deals where a phase 1 review takes around 3 months typically. This can be extended to a further 4 months if a formal in-depth review is undertaken. So if national security concerns are indeed seen by the authority. But also the parties may, before closing, ask or apply for a certificate of non-objection in case of doubt whether security concerns may exist. This process is kind of a fast-track process, which may take up to 2 months in order to get deal security. In any event, we recommend to our clients that these timelines must be factored in when setting up deal timetables. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's obviously a very, very important consideration for parties. Just touching upon still on this timing issue. Well, I wonder whether you could comment, because obviously in the UK we have a number of intergovernmental bodies that are going to be involved in the decision making. Are we anticipating that should slow down the process or not?
Yeah, it's a good question, Martha. I think it's very much a double-edged sword here in the UK, that the approach the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS, will involve cross-departmental input from many government departments across Whitehall On the one hand, parties can take some reassurance that those with the specific expertise to comment on the national security threats arising from deals will be the ones providing critical input. So, for example, in the defense sector, the Ministry of Defense will be very involved in matters relating to public security and order. The Home Office will have a very high level of input. But the flip side of this, as you say, Marta, is the risk that involving many different government departments in the review process will inevitably lead to administrative delays for parties experiencing FDI reviews here in the UK. And the UK government has very much followed in the steps of entities like CFIUS in the US, which follows a very cross-departmental approach to its reviews. But even there in that jurisdiction, we understand that there are very well-established regime. There can be delays resulting from this cross-departmental procedure. So yes, I think it's fair to say that the government has introduced what will hopefully be an expedited procedure, but might in reality lead to delays for parties.
Thanks, Will. And I guess with the broadening of the FDI rules, where we're potentially anticipating more filings, especially at least mandatory filings being caught. Are we getting a sense that most regulators across Europe are hiring more, increasing their resources to deal with this potential increase in work that may be coming their way? I wonder, Frederick, what you're seeing in Germany, for example.
Yes, we see indeed an increase in the number of filings that are submitted. In Germany, we have seen an average of plus 40% in the number of filings from 2018 to today. As of May this year, we have seen already more than 100 cases in Germany being filed. The authority is, as a result, hiring many more staff to process the high volume of filings. And this seems to us generally a trend across most European member states.
Okay, thank you. I guess maybe now we could turn on to what is, I think, another interesting theme that we're finding. And that is obviously what are the powers of the regulators? You know, can they prohibit, can they clear a deal, can they clear a deal with one of these? And obviously there is this power to prohibit a deal, which I think up until now we've seen used on a rare basis, but it has been used. I think it would be interesting to hear from Guillaume and Frederick, where we have seen recently some prohibition decisions in France and Germany, and to understand why those cases may have resulted in a prohibition decision, but also whether you think that we may well see more prohibition decisions going forward. Guillaume, should we start off with you maybe?
In France, even though the list of sensitive sectors requiring mandatory filing has been significantly extended over the past few years, and there has been a marked increase in the number of mandatory filings, prohibition decisions still remain rare. However, we've seen a number of deals blocked or abandoned when enforcement has been strict, signaling a rising tide of protectionism of French companies against non-European investors. Indeed, even in cases when investors were coming from close economic partners of France, such as the US or Canada. And I'll give you a few examples of that. In 2020, the French Ministry of Economy verbally opposed any interest shown by the American company Teledyne in the French defense company Photonoise, which specialized in night vision systems. The discussions had reached a point where conditions were in effect agreed to address any FDI concerns. However, ultimately, the decision came to an end with the formal prohibition by France at the end of 2020. This resulted in the sellers having to find another purchaser at a much lower price. More recently, in January 2021, in the summer 2021, the French Ministry of Economy vetoed the proposed takeover of Carrefour by Canadian retailer Couche-Tard in the name of French food sovereignty. the government rejected the deal before any filing was formally submitted, just because the transaction had been leaked in the press. The recent interventions of the French Minister of Economy regarding the proposed takeover of Carrefour by Couche-Tard shows the eminently political nature of the control of foreign direct investment in France. In this specific case, the intervention of the ministry created a deterrent effect since the government did not even use its veto. It's just announced that it would veto the transaction, and the threat was enough.
Thank you, Guillaume. Frederick, what's the position in Germany? Because I think there have been some interesting cases there as well.
Yes, indeed. As mentioned in the last decade, the approach of Germany was rather liberal. However, during the recent years, we have seen a series of cases where the parties had to abandon the deal under Fdi rules. For instance, in July 2018, it was decided to prevent the acquisition of a stake in a power grid operator by a Chinese investor. The authority said that there were security policy considerations and a strong interest in protecting critical energy infrastructure in Germany. Later in August 2018, Chinese undertaking had to withdraw from the planned acquisition of a German industrial tool manufacturer called Leifeld Metal Spinning after the authorities threatened to block the transaction. Similarly, in 2020, Germany blocked the investment in a steel or metals company, a manufacturer that produced metals used in semiconductors and infrared detectors, which could also dually be used for military purposes. And then later this year, again, there was a prohibition decision regarding a German company, IMST, which is a manufacturer of components with satellite radar communications and a 5G telecommunication technology. So indeed, there are more decisions which are critical, and the latest one may be when it came to CureVac, a German manufacturer of COVID-19 vaccines. The German government prevented that a minority stake could be acquired by a foreign investor in this critical medicine company. Thank you.
Thank you. So obviously it's clear that there can be prohibition decisions, but I think they are still rare. We'll have to see whether there will be more of those. But I think obviously it really does depend on the particular deal and circumstances. And I think, Frederick, as you mentioned, everything has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis earlier. Obviously, the regulators have the power to impose remedies or orders, be they structural or behavioural, to address national security concerns. Well, I wonder whether we could turn to you. What types of remedies have we tended to see that are acceptable?
Yeah, thanks, Mother. I think it's fair to say that jurisdictions across the EU have shown willingness to accept both structural and behavioural remedies. I should caveat this at the start to say that it is rare for regulators to actually publish details of decisions, and they are particularly reticent to give specifics around the types of remedies they have accepted. But nonetheless, we do have some insight here. And as with merger control regimes, as I say, structural and behavioural remedies tend to be accepted with a preference more for the former than the latter. If we look at the types of structural remedies that have been accepted, we have seen restrictions on the share ownership levels, for example, or forcing the divestment of certain assets or company subsidiaries that would be deemed to create more of a threat. On the behavioral side, we have seen ring fencing arrangements around access to confidential information, even physical access to certain sites, if it's an R&D facility, for example, or a site with particular national security relevance, or commitments. And commitments tend to be a big one to maintain manufacturing sites, for example, or employees or assets in the country of consideration. And if we look at some examples here in the UK, obviously the NSIA regime has not yet come into effect, so I cannot comment specifically on that. But we do have some guidance from the cases that have been decided on national security grounds since 2002 under the Enterprise Act. And here again, we have seen a mixture of remedies accepted. I would note, though, that there was a deal in 2019 involving the US private equity house Advent's acquisition of Cobham, in which the behavioral commitments offered in that case, though accepted at the time, were to a large extent reneged upon afterwards by Advent, particularly the commitments to maintain Cobham's UK defence sites. So whilst there is hopefully flexibility for both kinds of remedies, we might expect, certainly in the UK, a preference for structural remedies.
Cool. That's very interesting. I wonder whether we should also not forget, I guess, that if there are more mandatory filings that are likely to be triggered, that parties need to also be aware that if they fail to make that notification requirement, that there can be severe consequences in a number of jurisdictions for failing to notify, whether it be fines that are imposed or even criminal sanctions being imposed on parties. Could we now possibly turn to what would be our final topic, really, and that is obviously the impact of these FDI rules and regimes on M&A deals, and what practical advice and considerations you can give to clients and investors to help them try and mitigate any FDI risk and help them really navigate what appear to be quite a number of complex FDI regimes that exist across Europe. So I'll ask each of you to provide a key takeaway and practical advice that you'd like to give to those listening. Anna, would you like to?
Yes. Well, as we have touched upon earlier, as with other regulatory requirements, where an FDI filing is triggered, this can have, of course, timing implication for the deal timetable, particularly preparation of notification before signing to the extent possible, coordinating a collection of information for merger and FDI analysis at the same time as similar information is often needed to both, as well as early consideration of remedies and discussion with the FDI authorities in relation to the same to obtain an informal guidance, views on likely national security concern and how best to address them can help to mitigate these timing risks. So indeed, early engagement with the relevant regulator is also important to consider when dealing with this particular transaction in which an FDI filing will be triggered.
Thank you, Anna. Will, what's your tip?
Yeah, I think most importantly, for M&A activity going forward in the UK, an NSIA analysis really needs to be factored in as concurrently and with as much importance as merger control. It really does have to be seen as the new norm and way of doing things in order to get a transaction across the line. And going perhaps even further than this, what we might end up seeing going forward is a selection of target companies by based on any perceived national security relevance. So they might select target companies which are perceived to be lower risk from a national security point of view, and less chance that the UK government will want to get involved and review the deal, in the worst case block it, but probably in the best case at least delay it. And on that point, it is worth noting, again, with this link to merger control, that BEIS will have very similar powers to the CMA under our merger control regime to, for example, impose hold separate orders, preventing the companies, the target and the acquirer, from integrating whilst their review is still ongoing. And so this really does lend weight more to parties treating the two regimes with equal relevance and significance, and really factoring this into their ongoing commercial activity going forward.
So Guillaume, maybe you can give your hot tip or recommendation to investors, and then we'll finish off with Frederick's.
Well, in France, as a result of more FDI regulation, it is clear that parties now tend to factor this into the M&A deal analysis. And in particular, we are seeing the review of the applicability of FDI regimes in relevant jurisdictions being made globally in parallel to merger control and other regulatory concerns. And this is in light of the risk of high fines if we miss any filing. If a mandatory filing is required, we are seeing the increased use of split signing and closing arrangements, with the inclusions of suitable closing conditions in the deal documents. This also means that we have to ensure that we have relevant long stop dates in place to enable for sufficient time between signing and closing to obtain the clearances.
Thank you, Guillaume. Frederick, we'll finish off with your tip.
Yes, thank you. Maybe as a final point, particularly for multi-jurisdictional transactions, which involve more than only one screening regime, it will be important, in my view, to adopt and to work with legal advisors that can manage and coordinate a strategic approach to navigating through different European regimes. Not least because regulators in different jurisdictions increasingly consult one another on FDI matters. Indeed, in Europe, such consultation between European member states is actively encouraged by the European Commission. So presenting a consistent message to each authority is very important in my point of view.
Thank you, Frederick. Well, it looks like, I think it's clear it's a very complex and a very interesting subject area, but obviously one which is going to create increasing hurdles, I think, for parties to a deal, and that it's very important for them, obviously, to fully understand how the FDI regimes could apply to their deals. I know we're running a little bit over, but if there are any questions, I think it would be really great, and our panelists are keen to answer any questions people may have. Okay, so there's one question we have here. I think this is relevant to Guillaume. So this relates to the earlier case you were talking about. So the Canadian company Couche-Tard's proposed investment in Carrefour, and how that was blocked and very clearly politically motivated. So the question is, it looks like France is one of those jurisdictions where there is a potential risk of politicization of FDI reviews. Do you agree? And if so, what can parties do to address any potential politicization in FDI reviews in France or other countries?
Yes, you're right, Marta. The Couche-Tard Carrefour deal was blocked for very political reasons. Indeed, all it took was for the French Finance Ministry, Bruno Le Maire, to publicly state that he was opposed to the deal before any FDI filing was made for the deal to be abandoned. Couche-Tard clearly realized that once Mr. Le Maire had adopted this view, any FDI review was going to end one way, with the deal being blocked. In fact, the politicization of deals in France, though it is rare for such decisions to be taken, is of course nonetheless concerning for prospective investors. I would say, however, that although the French government was very open about its opposition to this deal, and perhaps more so than what we've seen being done by other governments to date, the politicization of deals is really rare and does not really go hand in hand with FDI reviews in France. I think that prospective investors would be able to recognize situations where there is a particular risk that a transaction could encounter political opposition. In France, Carrefour is clearly a widespread national groceries retailer, one that is almost everywhere, synonymous with grocery shopping in France. Subsequently, it's very important to French citizens. If you couple that with the fact that groceries and food production is a key area for protection under the French FDI system, I think it was arguably inevitable that the deal will attract a high level of political attention. As such, I think that in terms of advice to parties, the message is really to be aware of prospective deals involving targets which have a particular importance or significance to the countries being invested in. If a foreign entity is planning to buy a domestic national champion like Carrefour in France or, say, Arm in the UK, then the parties need to take extra steps to tactically consider how they will present this deal to the relevant national governments and regulators to try and assure the same that the deal will not present any relevant concerns. This does not mean that any such deals are non-starters necessarily, but extra care must be taken when contemplating deals that are more likely than others to attract political attention. And there is no hard and fast rule as to when such political attention will arise. But I would submit that, generally speaking, and for the reasons noted, it should be clear more often than not when such a risk is more likely.
Thanks, Guillaume. I know we're at the end of our time, but we have got another question. I just wonder whether Frederick could answer this one quickly. And this is on the sectors. And the question is, do we think this expansion of sectors is just a temporary measure, sort of like a knee-jerk reaction to the COVID pandemic, or do we think it's here to stay? What are your thoughts there?
Yes, unfortunately, I think it's here to stay. The law has been amended several times during the last years, and each time the list of sectors or industries was getting longer. The pandemic has a tremendous impact on politics in Germany. And I do not think that all pandemic-related biotechnology companies or industries will be deleted from the list later when hopefully the pandemic is gone. So I think, unfortunately, it's here to stay.
Okay, thank you, Frederick. Well, look, we are just now slightly over 10 o'clock, so I think we will finish there. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today to listen to our webinar. We're very happy to answer any further questions, so please do feel free to get in touch and we'd be happy to respond. I think just one final message for everyone. We obviously are carrying out our FDI in Focus webinar series. Next week at the same time, our colleagues will be giving an Asia-Pacific perspective, where they'll be giving an overview of market trends and themes that are taking place in China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. So please do dial in, and we look forward to hearing any of your comments on how you're finding the FDI rules applying across these countries. Thank you very much, everybody.